Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, episode 72.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors. Here's your host, Dr. Jamie Richards.
Welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic. I'm your host, Dr. Jamie Richards. Today, myself and Dr. Mike Gibson dive into communication, and specifically we talk about the application of the Feynman Technique in terms of how to break down what it is you're doing into a simple communication strategy. So really understanding these concepts on the far side of complexity so we can make this extremely simple. We also introduce you to a free download, which is the communication tool. This is something we use in our practice almost every single day, at least on a weekly basis, and it's something that myself and our associate doctors go back to over and over and over again. So if you're looking for one place to unify all of your communication that you get from different workshops, seminars, this podcast, and others, the communication tool is a great resource for that. So enjoy today's episode of Life by Design for Chiropractors. Hey Mike, welcome to Life by Design for Chiropractors.
Thanks, Jamie.
Always good to have you back. We always have a great topic in store, and today we're talking about communication in general, but you had a great idea to talk about specifically the Feynman technique. I guess, is that how you say it? Feynman?
Feynman? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I'm not really sure the pronunciation, but when it comes to communication, it's definitely at the core of everything. And clearly, that's something I love to talk about. I love to dig into communication. It's fun for me. I know other people have more joy in practice in other areas and they struggle with communication. So whether you're good at it and want to get better, or whether you're having a challenge, I think this technique and maybe more specifically applying this and then using our communication tool or a tool like the communication tool gives you a place to really work through this process. So Mike, why don't you maybe just start off by talking a bit about how communication is everywhere? Because I think people, they love to say communicate at the table, but they forget that they're also communicating in their marketing or, in writing. So it goes far beyond just table talk.
Yeah, I truly believe, and we had some great discussions about this when we were originally creating the framework for Life by Design for Chiropractors and our whole program and helping chiropractors succeed. And what are the 4 requirements? So it didn't have to be 4, but it ended up being 4. What are the requirements to be successful as a chiropractor? And one of the requirements is communication. But you're right, it's not just table talk. It's so much bigger than that. In fact, I'm going to argue that communication and the ability to be a masterful communicator is at the core of just being a successful human being and enjoying life. Because whether it's talking to your kids, trying to get them to clean their room, or talking with your spouse, or trying to convince people that chiropractic is something that they should consider, or then even just trying to explain their results once they're in the office, so the whole area of conversion. And then of course, yes, table talk and ongoing, as I always call it, ongoing marketing, which is really what table talk is, and really how that relates to retention. At the core of all of that is the ability to communicate effectively.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that it's in all areas of life, and it kind of falls into the same, we've talked about it in the Ultimate Chiropractic Sales Playbook, this idea of, you're constantly selling. And I know people have a difficult relationship with selling sometimes, but you're constantly selling people on something, on getting them to take action, getting them to do something that you would like them to do, getting them to marry you, whatever you're selling them on. And communication is essentially the same thing. You're just constantly in communication with people. And I would say, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, especially you have young kids, but they're kind of more in this age range, and you're a hockey coach, so you see this. I get the feeling that communication is an art that's being lost, especially, people using cell phones more and people texting versus calling. I don't know. What do you see, Mike? To me, it seems like kids, I sound like that old guy on the porch, right? Kids these days don't communicate at the same level as, years before.
It's true. And it's because they just don't have to. And, it comes back to another big reason and goal and objective behind this podcast is this idea of how important practice is. And I think, as you're discussing, kids these days, we do really sound old. They don't practice it. They don't have to because they don't talk, right? They text, and texts are super, super short. And you know what? I mean, even I find myself sometimes when we're communicating, I'm communicating less and less. I'm doing it more by email, more by text. So it's not just the younger people, but I really do think it's because they're just out of practice. There's no need for them to do so, and they've never developed this skill properly. So I see it all the time. I see it especially when we're hiring, whether it's at a gym or in the office. I definitely see it when we're interviewing younger people, and actually technology in the sense has definitely minimized our need for solid, effective communication strategies, and I think it's really taken away. And I think in a lot of things, this is absolutely taking away from our ability to communicate to our practice members and be successful in practice. And I do think for younger docs, this is a big problem.
Well, and it makes this whole process even more important, right? It's you're day to day interacting with people, and you're moving people through a process. You're getting agreements with people, and if you're not solid at communicating, then I just don't understand how you think this is going to happen. It's not going to happen through a text message. It's not going to happen by sending them an email and getting them to make an agreement through that avenue. So if anything, like many things in business, the better you get at this, the more distinct you're going to be from other people in your market. And when it comes down to being successful, especially in comparison to, say, other healthcare providers or other chiropractors, you're constantly looking for that winning edge. You're looking for that thing that differentiates you from every other practitioner. And this could be a place. I think we often think of marketing. And so whether it's our brand or, what we call ourselves or how we look, and yes, all of those places should be addressed. And we want to develop as much of a proprietary process as possible. But I think this is an untapped vehicle to differentiate yourself, right? This is an untapped area. And so what we put together is a communication tool. Now, it's another Excel document, but the difference is this is split up into a series of tabs, and each tab has a different touch point in your practice. So whether it's the first phone call or day one or the examination or day two or PE1 and so on, all the way down the path. Because as much as there's some general communication about your brand story or about what you do, there's also very specific communication. And I'm not talking about a script, by the way. I'm talking about there's very specific communication at every single pivot point along the way. And Mike, I think this communication tool lends itself very, very well to this Feynman technique.
Well, sure. And just to preface that is that the communication tool was developed because one of the biggest things when coaching and consulting other chiropractors that they were lacking was just this piece, this communication piece. And so, and I've never found anyone to disagree that communication is one, if not the most important, maybe besides actually delivering the adjustment, tools and skills that you need. But yet, it was my observation, tell me if yours was different, but just nobody was practicing it. We may pick up a script from somebody, but how often were people actually practicing it? And how often were people actually improving upon it? How much thought was going into what that script actually was? Were they just using it because so-and-so said it was a good idea?
Right.
Or did they take the time to actually think through what am I communicating? How are people going to respond to this? Because communication, as we often forget, isn't just speaking, it's listening, right? It's changing the message based on who we're speaking to. But how often, are we actually taking the time to dig into actually what is it that we're saying? And who is it that we're saying it to? And what type of responses am I getting? And how can I then change the strategy to, how do I improve upon it based on the feedback I'm getting in real life situations? That was what was missing. That's what the communication tool, that's why we created it, is essentially to bridge that gap and help docs, be better at this. And,
right.
And one other thing I was just thinking about actually as I was listening to you is, Yes, obviously the communication tool, the way it was designed is for face-to-face interactions, right? It's for the, as you called them, the pivot points in practice, the most important interactions that we have on a continuous, repetitive basis with our practice members. But there's also another skill that is communication as it relates to online, because a lot of the marketing that a lot of us do is online, and I think it's an entirely, there's similarities but also differences in developing the skill that is communicating online. And I've definitely seen observations where people are definitely better than this. I always joke with John, Dr. John in my office. He's much better at communicating online than I am. Right? I don't know why. He's just much better at it than I am. And so that's a whole nother skill. And I didn't want it to come across like communicating online or communicating by text or by email isn't a valuable asset, because it is. But in the context of our discussion today, we're talking more about those daily visits, those daily pivot points that we want to improve our communication skills around. So sorry, a little bit of a tangent there, but I think it was an important clarification.
Yeah, I think so, totally. And you're right. I think that, as an outsider and knowing both you and John probably has a little bit more patience.
Yes.
And the ability to, I get it, because the ability to communicate online often requires this back and forth and interaction and, really sugarcoating everything for people. And, I know you and I both like to get right to the point. And so that tends to be, I think, a great communication strategy for in-person. And I think that's what's made you strong in that area. But yeah, it's pretty funny to hear you talk about that. But I do think it's an important distinction. And to piggyback on that thought, you're talking about the lack of practice. And of course, you could use the analogy of playing sports or anything else where people practice to become excellent. Chiropractors don't practice. We do not practice our even technique. And again, I'm making a blanket statement here, but for the general purpose of this, there's not a lot of practice in technique. There's definitely not a lot of practice in communication. And one of the things that I've been most proud of, Mike, in the consulting side of things for us is, not just sharing with people frameworks and then getting them to implement, but one of the things we've been doing is actually having them record themselves. And, having a sports background, I've spent lots of time watching game film, and I've got so much value out of watching the game film and getting constructive feedback about what I'm doing or how I'm approaching something. And I thought, the same principle applies here. And so, having this communication tool for our clients gives them a place to store all the information, break it down pivot point by pivot point, and then to add to it, which is what we do in my practice. So still being in practice, we have a communication tool. If I'm in the shift and I say something great, and you know what? Sometimes I say something great, just like you do. And just like everybody listening, you say something, wow, that was really profound. I like the way I said that. I write it down in the shift. And then what'll happen is in the post shift, we'll actually add that to the communication tool. So it's a living, breathing document that as you're both doing your day in and day out, as you're listening to yourself or having coaching that's breaking down your game film, we can constantly add to this tool as well, which is, I think, what makes it so valuable. Because think about all the things that you've been taught. They're sitting in a PDF somewhere in a folder somewhere, or they're printed out and you never see them again. The communication tool allows you to focus them into one place. And then every time I want to know about communication on day one, I know the exact place that I get to visit.
Yeah. And it's been such a valuable tool in our practice too, especially when we brought on new associates, right?
Yes.
That whole process has just been such an important part of the learning. And I couldn't agree more with you that it's the recording. And sometimes, as a coach, I don't even need to listen to the recording, but just having a client actually record themselves and listen to themselves, they can pick out, the thing that they could improve upon. So it doesn't even, you don't always have to have someone that is there to actually give you direct feedback. Just listening to it yourself, I find that most of my clients, 90% of the time, I'm like, hey, did you record that? Yeah, I did. I listened to it. I know what I did wrong. You don't need to listen to it.
Right. They don't want you to.
Yeah. But the point is that we can pick it out, right? But if we're not getting that instant feedback, then we just kind of overlook it a lot of times. Right. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. And back to Dr. Feynman, and this is kind of, Dr. Feynman, for those of you who don't know, is a U.S. physicist. He won the Nobel Prize way back in, I think, the mid-'60s. Yeah, he 66. Was 66, yeah. He was famous for working on the Manhattan Project and developing the atomic bomb, and just a fascinating guy. I mean, if you want to, there's a book, one of the books that he wrote. was called Surely You Must Be Joking, Mr. Feynman. And to be honest, I don't even know if he wrote it, but it was just essentially all these crazy stories about his life. Just a really entertaining, fascinating guy, a really fascinating book. Actually, I highly recommend it. Lots to be learned from it, but also too just very, very entertaining. But one of the things that I picked up from reading the book was his 4-step, I think they actually call it the Feynman Technique, and it's the 4 steps technique for learning. And I think the crux of what he figured out over time, because one of the things that he was really well known for is that he became like an expert in like so many different things. And so people will go to him and say, hey, how were you able to learn and become so masterful at so many different things? And this was his response. So just to kind of give it some context here. So I've read and heard people describe this in many different ways. So, based on or depending on where you've learned this from, it may be slightly different. But this is the 4-step process that I found was most relevant to us as chiropractors and to us using the communication tool. So just very, very quickly, let me go through the 4 things, and then we can apply it to how to properly use the communication tool and how to get the most out of it. So number 1 is the Feynman technique. Number 1, identify the subject. So he would recommend that you write down absolutely everything you know about the topic. And as you mentioned, Jamie, that you guys are doing with communication tools, each time you run into new sources of information, add them to the notes. So maybe you are at a conference or maybe you're listening to this podcast, maybe you're listening to someone else on social media and they say something that you really, really like. It's about always adding to the communication tool, adding, improving, developing the communication tool as a base core foundational communication strategy. So that's number 1. Number 2, teach it to a child. And I think I was thinking more about this in preparation for this. I think this really depends on the topic. If Dr. Feynman was talking to you and I, Jamie, about physics, I imagine he'd have to, we might as well be a child, because maybe I shouldn't speak for yourself, but I have no idea what he's talking about, right? So I think when you say teach it to a child, it depends on the topic itself. And I think when it comes to chiropractic, that people really have no idea what it's really about. And so I think a lot of times when we're looking at our strategies, we really have to think back to, okay, how would I say this to a child? Or how would I say this to someone who has absolutely no background for understanding what this is? And maybe even worse, how do I speak to someone where we're going to have to take what they currently know and try and erase it and start fresh? So he talks about teaching it to a child. I love it because it's, of course, trying to speak in as plain terms as possible. Obviously he's talking about how children don't understand jargon or lexicon of dense vocabulary. Well, that's the case oftentimes when we get talking about chiropractic. There's some really good lessons there. And I think the other big part of that is brevity. And again, this comes full circle to our original conversation on this episode about, just people, the way they communicate. And a part of that was brevity, right? And the way that we're communicating, our attention spans, but also communication via text or email, it's gotten really, 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 really short. And I think that is another good lesson that we need to keep in the back of our mind when we are communicating anything, is that we need to be brief. We need to be concise. We need to be brief. We need to speak in plain terms. We need to think almost like we're teaching a child. So that was step number 2. Okay. Number 3 was to identify knowledge gaps. And in my mind, step 3 and step 4 for the context of the communication tool, I think we kind of blend these together. But number 3 for him was identify your knowledge gaps. Number 4 was organize, simplify, and tell the story. So, I think this is where the real learning happens. And I think you described it perfectly, Jamie, is the best way, I think, for us to identify our learning gaps. I mean, part of the process can be accomplished through just reading through your own strategies. But I think a lot of the gaps and the just understanding and identifying those gaps happens when we either practice it, or even better, when we actually, practice it in practice, when we say it to a real practice member, and then record it even better. But that's when I find, and maybe Jamie, you can give me some feedback here, but that's what I find is the best way to identify the gaps, is to actually try it, use it, whether it's in practice, maybe it's practicing with your associates, maybe it's actually with a practice member. But that's when they become obvious, because you start talking and then you get to a point and go, oh crap, there's a big gap there. There was a piece I missed. I went step 1, 2, 3, 7, and I forgot some. So that's what, for me anyway, that's when I tend to recognize, oh, I missed a few pieces. There are some knowledge gaps there. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's probably the number one way that you're going to identify the gaps. I think you could also rely in some cases on your metrics. So you could rely on your success surveillance system to say, okay, I'm really great on the conversion at day 1 and day 2. And then at the end of corrective care, my conversion is terrible. So maybe there's something about that conversation. I know personally, and I've talked about this before in our previous practice, where we had the really wonderful growth and things were just going great, but I found that we weren't getting over a certain hump. And when I went and looked at my statistics, it was that a lot of people were starting. We had a really high rate of accepting cases. People completed their corrective care, but my rate of them going from corrective into the next stage was much lower than I thought, and much lower than I really wanted it to be by a ton, actually, to be honest. And so what I realized was when I dug into my conversation, I didn't have a conversation. I didn't really have a framework that I had set out. And so that's a case where my metrics for my success surveillance system allowed me to identify that I had a gap in understanding or a gap in communication there.
Yeah, I love it. And number 4 is organize, simplify, and tell a story. And for me, it's a discussion and an action all around mastery. Right? Mm-hmm. It's about, and I feel like I've been talking about this a lot because I think it's a principle, so it seems to apply to virtually every part of practice, but it's certainly something that's come up a lot in my coaching lately, and it's this idea of simplicity on the far side of complexity. And I think this absolutely applies to this, and I think this is what Dr. Feynman was talking about when he's talking about, reorganizing, simplifying, and telling a story, is that telling stories are a great way to get a message and to communicate, right? We all know that storytelling, the best storytellers are almost always the best communicators, but also too in just simplifying it and just taking the information and saying, okay, this is all of the information. And this is actually a strategy, this is kind of a little bonus tip here. This is a strategy that I use whenever I'm actually writing. So if I'm writing a blog, I'll write the blog post, and then when I've got it to a second or third draft where I'm happy with it, one of my last steps is actually to say, okay, let me see if I can write this in 2/3 of the amount of words that I used in the final draft. How do I simplify? How do I say the exact same thing, accomplish the same goal, but say it in less words? And I think this is where Dr. Feynman was talking about is really mastery. How do we master this communication strategy? And I think simplifying and then trying to add stories wherever we can really makes good communication great.
I think visually, to add on to this as well, and I know Feynman did talk about this, and it was a core part of his technique, was diagrams and actually drawings and things along those lines. And I was thinking of ours, and this is exactly, Mike, how the Lifetime Care Map was born. It's also how the Ultimate Chiropractic Marketing Blueprint was born, right? We created these infographics based on all of this information that we had, and we wanted to organize it, simplify it, and tell a story. So there's a couple great examples where we've taken that and narrowed it down to something where if you just looked at it, I think you'd have a really good idea of what it is that we were trying to communicate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That just the more and more you learn about how people learn. Obviously, the visual component. So many people are those visual learners. So the more that we can incorporate images, of course, the more likely, the more successful we'll be at communicating our message.
So why don't we finish up by talking about how someone would actually go ahead and use this tool?
For sure, and hopefully now everyone who's listening, if we've done a good job, could take a pen and paper and write down the step-by-step process to doing so. Because essentially, all we're doing here, and again, this was kind of one of those aha moments where I was reading more about Dr. Feynman and this technique, and I'm like, this is exactly what we're currently doing with the communication tool. So anyway, I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, I wrote down some steps here, pretty simple. Number 1 is you've got to study first, study communication, study psychology, study marketing, so that you have some principles with which to start from. So it's one thing, of course, how do you know if what you said worked? Well, of course, or is good. Of course, you made up a great point about using the SSS and using metrics to get feedback as to how well you communicated the message. But the other part of that is just learning how to be a better marketer, a better communicator, understanding psychology, so that you can minimize the amount of metrics and the amount of negative feedback you need to get before you see success. So I think just studying first and then also using your metrics to give you immediate feedback would be where I would start. Create your own communication tool. So of course, I think are we going to offer this in the download, Jamie?
I was just going to say, do you want to give it away for free?
Yeah, for sure. We'll list it. And listen, it's simple. I think we have, we have given in a past episode, and people are always like, I think it's missing something.
Exactly.
Because there's really not a lot to it, right? But essentially, what it does is it provides an easy document to keep everything in one place. Like you said, most people tend to have this in like 100 different places. The idea here was just to put everything in one place. No, there's not going to be a whole bunch of strategies filled in for you already. That's step 2, to create your own communication tool, right? You're not us. You don't necessarily practice in exactly the same way. The best way to do this is to come up with your own communication strategy. I'd encourage you to just write down exactly what you say now and use that as a starting point. And that'll be a great way for you to identify, what's already good, what's working, but also where are the biggest gaps in knowledge, like Dr. Feynman talked about. So number 2 is to create your own communication tool. We'll put a link in the show notes for you to download that to get started. Number 3 is to practice. And, Jamie, you talked about this, and I know we've done a lot of this in the past, but we used to practice with associates. So in our regular training meeting, we'd actually spend the time to role play and actually go through it together. And I do find that people tend to, communicate better when it's role playing and when it's with your peers for whatever reason we just do. Sure. But when we get into the game in front of a real practice member, things don't tend to nearly go as well. But I think you need to practice regularly, and I think a lot of those gaps can be bridged in the practicing. Number 4 is to prepare. So once you've practiced, how do you refine that? How do you continue to prepare on your own? And the biggest piece for this is now taking this communication tool. And if you show up in the morning and you've got a day one, you got a new person coming in, this is the first time they've come in, as part of your pre-shift huddle or your pre-shift prep, I would recommend getting your communication tool out and actually reading through your strategy so it's fresh in your mind, right? You're not going to forget anything. You've just read it. So an hour later when you actually go into that, it's fresh. It's right there. Maybe read it again if you do have the time right before you go in. That would be even better. But number 4 is to prepare. Number 5 is to actually do it, is to perform it, is to, do your best to use your strategy the best you can given the person that's in front of you. And then from there, it's about editing, right? It's about improving. It's about identifying the gaps. It's about practicing again. It's about continuing to prepare. It's continuing to perform and repeat and, repeat, just going back and back. And like you said, I love the way that you phrased it. It's a living, breathing document. It's always constantly changing and getting better.
Yeah, it's such a great tool, guys. And Mike applying this Feynman technique, I think, really adds a whole other level to it, but at the same time, really just simplifies what it is we're asking you to do. And you just, like I said, when you download it, there's really nothing there other than the names and the tabs of the different pivot points. And, it becomes your document. So, when you email me and say, I think it's empty, it is empty. That's because it's for you to fill in, whether it's going to be through listening to the podcast or using your resources, or just continuing to do this over the course of time. It is a rinse and repeat document. It happens over and over and over again. And even if you think you're great at communication, you're only going to be better if you apply this communication tool. And I know that from experience. I know that, communication is a strong point for me. But when I started to actually break it down and start to simplify it as I had to teach it to other people, it made me even better. And using the communication tool is something we do every single week in our practice. It's been great, not just for my associates. It's been tremendous for me. So I can't say enough about it. So go to the show notes, guys. lifebydesignforchiropractors.com/podcast. You'll find today's episode and you can see it in there. Mike, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks. Loved it as always.
And thanks for listening to Life by Design for Chiropractors, the voice of reason in chiropractic.
Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast for chiropractors.